Starting this step, let's start building the REST API for the social media application. As we talked about earlier, the key resources are users and posts. Let's focus on getting the fundamentals ready for users in this specific step. For the user, I would want to store ID, name, and birth date. So let's create a bean for user with ID, name, and birth date. So I'd go in here and say new class. And I would want to call this user. And I would want to put it into a package .user. And I would go ahead and say finish. So we want to create a user class. And in here, we would want to have ID, name, and birth date. So private integer ID, private name would be a string. And the last one I would want to store is the birth date. So private local date, birth date. Okay, ID, name, and birth date, ID, name, and birth date. These look good. So we have now defined all the member variables we would want in our user bean. Let's do an organize imports. And you would see that import Java time local date is imported in. Let's now create getters, setters, constructor, and the toString method as well. So I'll do right click, source, generate constructor using fields. I would want to make use of all the fields which are present in here. And I would want to insert it as the last member. Let's say generate. So the constructor is now generated for us. I'll again go over here and say right click, source, generate getters and setters, select all. And I would leave the insertion point as last member and say generate. The getters and setters are now generated. Last thing I would want to generate is the toString method as well. Source, generate toString, and I would go ahead and generate the toString method as well. So the toString method is generated for us as well. So let's save this. So we have our user bean ready with all the details that we would need. What we want to be able to do is to build a REST API around this user bean. We would want to be able to save the details of the user, retrieve the details of the user, delete a specific user, and do a lot of operations with the specific user. And to be able to play with a database and to be able to perform operations with something which is stored in a database, we would create a DAO object or a DAO object, data access object. So let's go ahead and create a DAO service to manage this. So I'll say new class, UserDaoService, and I'll say finish. I would want Spring to manage this. That's why I'll make this at component. If you organize imports, you would see org Spring Framework stereotype component imported in. Now, what do you want to do in this specific UserDaoService? What I want to do in this specific UserDaoService is to implement methods to be able to retrieve all users, to be able to save details of a specific user, to be able to retrieve details of a specific user. So these are all the methods that I would want to implement in this specific UserDaoService. And typically what we want to do is we would want to store all the user details in the database, and we want to use JPA or Hibernate to talk to the database. What we'll do for now is to keep things simple. What we'll do is we'll create a static list. So we'll have the UserDaoService talk to the static array list which we would create in here. A little later in the course, we will learn a lot more about JPA and Hibernate, and we will convert all the REST API that we create to talk to the database. For now, what we'll be doing is we'll be creating a static array list, and we'll be using UserDaoService to talk to the static array list. So what we'll do in here is to create a private static list of users is equal to new array list. Let's organize imports. I want to import Java util list, and you would also see Java util.array list imported in. So these are the two imports which are coming in. We have a static empty list right now. What I want to do is to initialize this with a set of users. So I'll say static. So we are creating a static block in here, and I would say users.add. I can create a new user. user ID. The next one is the name. Let's say Adam. And the last one is the birth date. Local date dot nav would give the current date. And let's say these guys are born a long time back. So I'll say minus years. Let's say I would want to make Adam 30 years old. So I'll say minus years 30 and put a semicolon at the end. So we are creating Adam who is 30 years old. So we are using local date to fetch the current date and subtracting 30 years from it. And let's create a couple more users. I'll say 2. Let this be Eve. And let's make Eve 25 years old. And the last one we want to create is 3. And let's call him Jim. And let's give him an age of 20. And save this down. And now find all should be really easy to implement, right? All that I need to do is to say return users. In this step, we created our user bean and we created a UserDaoService. Right now, the UserDaoService is retrieving all the details from a static user list. A little later in the course, we'll be making use of JPI and Hibernate and we'll be talking to a database. In the next step, let's see how to build a REST API to retrieve details of all the users. I'll see you in the next step.